The Deadlands did not kill with the swift, honorable strike of a warrior's blade. It killed with a slow, suffocating embrace, freezing the blood in the veins and turning hope into brittle, shattered ice. For 3 days and 3 nights, Alpha Cassian had led the ragged, starving remnants of the Ashen Peak Pack through the howling white abyss of the northern tundra. They were a procession of ghosts, placing one frostbitten foot in front of the other, blinded by a relentless blizzard that sought to bury them completely. Cassian pushed forward at the head of the column, his massive, battle-hardened frame leaning heavily into the gale. The thick, dark wolf pelt mantle he wore, once a symbol of his absolute terrifying dominance, was now heavy with frozen sleet, dragging him down like an anchor. Behind him, the sounds of his dying pack carried on the wind, the ragged, wet coughs of the elders, the pathetic, fading whimpers of the pups, and the crunch of boots on snow that grew slower with every passing hour. Their territory, the once mighty Ashen Peak, was gone. A supernatural blight had swept through their forests a year ago, a creeping decay that turned the ancient pines to ash and the rich soil to toxic, choking dust. The rivers had dried into cracked mud, and the prey had simply vanished. Cassian, a warlord who had built his empire on the belief that physical strength could conquer any obstacle, had fought the blight with everything he had. He had driven his warriors to exhaustion, expanding their borders, trying to take land from rival packs by force. But you could not punch a famine. You could not intimidate the dying earth. And so, driven to the absolute brink of extinction, Cassian had ordered this final, desperate march into the Deadlands. They were chasing a myth. The elders spoke of the sunlit cradle, a legendary sanctuary hidden deep within the frozen wastes, a place of eternal spring and abundant life carved out by the gods themselves. It was a fool's errand, a child's fairy tale, but starvation had left the ruthless Alpha with no other choices. "Cassian," a harsh, shivering voice called out beside him. He turned his head slightly, the ice cracking in his dark beard. Walking beside him was Selene. She was his chosen Luna, a massive, fiercely scarred warrior woman who had once been the most lethal fighter in the Ashen Peak vanguard. When Cassian had chosen her, he had believed her brute strength and ruthless tactical mind were exactly what his pack needed to survive. But out here, in the unforgiving face of nature's wrath, Selene's immense physical strength was utterly useless. Her heavily muscled arms were wrapped tightly around her torso. Her lips were tinged a sickly pale blue, and her normally fierce eyes were wide with a creeping, undeniable panic. "The rearguard is failing," Selene gasped, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She had to shout to be heard over the screaming wind. 2 more elders collapsed. "The pups can't walk. We have to stop, Cassian. We have to make camp or we will all freeze in our tracks." "If we stop, we die," Cassian roared back, his voice a gravelly bark of pure desperation. "There is no shelter. There is no wood for a fire. Keep moving." "Force them to their feet, Selene. Show the strength you boast of." Selene flinched, a flash of resentful anger crossing her frozen features before she turned back to scream at the stragglers, her voice cracking under the strain. Cassian turned his face back into the biting wind, his chest heaving. The sheer, overwhelming guilt of a failing king pressed down on him, heavier than the snow. His inner wolf, usually a roaring beast of dominance and pride, was whining in the dark corners of his mind, completely broken. The biting cold whipped against Cassian's scarred cheeks, and as the wind howled through the skeletal branches of the dead pine trees, it sounded exactly like the jeering, mocking laughter of his own pack from 3 years ago. The cold triggered the memory, dragging Cassian backward in time, it forcing him to relive the exact moment he had doomed his own soul. It had been a crisp, beautiful autumn day in the courtyard of Ashen Peak. The air had smelled of roasted venison and blooming pine, and the pack had gathered in their hundreds to witness the Alpha accept his fated mate. The moon goddess had woven their souls together, a cosmic decree that was supposed to be the greatest blessing a pack could receive. But when the heavy oak doors of the keep had opened, there was no fierce warrior queen waiting for him. There was only Aurelia. Cassian's heart clenched in his chest as the memory washed over him with crystal clarity. Aurelia had been small, incredibly fragile, wearing a simple white linen dress that made her look like a ghost among the heavily armored wolves of his court. Her dark hair had cascaded down her back in soft waves, and her face was breathtakingly beautiful. But her eyes were what had sealed her fate. They were a milky, translucent, pale blue, completely devoid of sight. She was the blind Luna, a defective mate. In a society that worshipped a martial prowess, physical perfection, and the ability to hunt and fight, a blind Luna was considered a curse. As Aurelia had stepped forward, guided by a trembling servant, the courtyard had erupted into cruel, vicious whispers. Cassian remembered the way his warriors had looked at him, their eyes filled with pity and disgust. He remembered Celine standing in the front row, a sneer of pure contempt twisting her lips as she looked at the fragile, sightless girl. Cassian's pride, his overwhelming toxic arrogance, had flared like a wildfire. He was the alpha of Ashen Peak. He was the apex predator of the mountains. He could not, would not be leashed to a cripple who couldn't even see the enemies at their gates. He had completely ignored the desperate, agonizing pull of his inner wolf, which had begged him to run to her, to wrap her in his mantle and protect her from the cruel stares. Instead, he had stepped forward, his face a mask of cold, unfeeling stone. "I am the alpha of Ashen Peak," Cassian's own voice echoed in his memory, dripping with cruel authority. "My bloodline demands strength. My pack demands a queen who can lead the vanguard, not a burden who must be led by the hand. I, Alpha Cassian, reject you, Aurelia. I sever this bond. You are no Luna of mine." The collective gasp of the pack had been deafening. Rejecting a fated mate was a profound taboo. A violent tearing of the soul. Cassian had felt a sickening, white-hot agony rip through his chest, as if a physical blade had severed his heart in two. But Aurelia had not screamed. She had not fallen to her knees and begged, as the crowd had expected. She had simply stood there, her milky, unseeing eyes staring blankly ahead. A single tear had slipped down her pale cheek, catching the autumn sunlight. "You value only the strength of the flesh, Alpha," Aurelia had whispered, her voice carrying a strange, resonant echo that had silenced the murmuring crowd. "You are blind to the true shape of the world. When the ash falls and the earth dies, your strength will not save you." Infuriated by her calm defiance, Cassian had ordered his guards to strip her of her pack garments. He had elevated Celine to his side that very afternoon, crowning the warrior woman as his new, strong Luna. And as the sun began to set, he had ordered his guards to march the blind, frail Aurelia to the absolute edge of their territory, casting her out into the freezing, lethal expanse of the Deadlands with nothing but the clothes on her back. He had expected her to die by nightfall. The pack had celebrated, feasting and drinking, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just sentenced an innocent, sightless woman to freeze to death in the dark. Cassian stumbled, his heavy boot catching on a jagged rock hidden beneath the snow, violently snapping him back to the present. He hit the frozen earth hard, his knees bruising against the ice. He gasped for air, the freezing wind searing his lungs. The memory of Aurelia's unseeing eyes haunted him. "When the ash falls and the earth dies, your strength will not save you." Her words, once dismissed as the bitter ramblings of a scorned woman, had become a terrifying, apocalyptic prophecy. "Alpha!" a desperate voice cried out from behind. Cassian forced his head up. 10 yards back, an elder had collapsed into the snowdrift. A young mother, shivering uncontrollably, was kneeling beside him, clutching a whimpering pup to her chest. They couldn't go on. The cold had finally won. Celine stumbled over to Cassian, her face a mask of pure despair. "It's over," she whispered, her voice completely broken, her arrogant warrior facade stripped away by the sheer brutality of nature. "We are going to die here, Cassian. There is no sanctuary. We chased a ghost." Cassian stared at his dying pack. The guilt was a physical, crushing weight that finally brought the warlord to his lowest point. He had thrown away his soul, and in return, the gods had turned his kingdom to dust. He closed his eyes, preparing to let the freezing numbness take him, preparing to die in the exact same frozen hell he had condemned his true mate to 3 years ago. But then the wind shifted. It was a subtle change at first. The howling, ear-splitting shriek of the blizzard suddenly dropped in pitch. Cassian opened his eyes, a deep frown creasing his frostbitten brow. A sudden, impossible gust of air swept over him. It was not the biting, razor-sharp cold of the tundra. It was warm. Cassian gasped, pushing himself up on his hands. The air brushing against his cheeks carried a temperature that hadn't been felt in the Deadlands in a millennium. He flared his nostrils, his alpha senses desperately seeking out the source. Through the suffocating stench of wet fur, freezing snow, and impending death, a new scent pierced the air. It was overwhelmingly beautiful, a direct contradiction to the rotting, dying world around them. It was the rich, intoxicating aroma of blooming jasmine flowers, damp, fertile spring earth, and fresh, running crystal water. Cassian's inner wolf, which had been whimpering in the dark, suddenly threw its head back and let out a frantic, hopeful howl within his mind. "Get up," Cassian breathed, his voice trembling. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the burning ache in his frozen joints. He turned to his dying pack, his golden eyes flashing with a sudden manic light. "Get up! Do you smell that? The wind. It's warm." Celine lifted her head, her blue lips parting in shock as the warm breeze washed over her. The shivering mother with the pup looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "The cradle!" Cassian roared, a sudden violent surge of adrenaline flooding his exhausted muscles. He pointed a heavy, leather-clad finger into the blinding white storm ahead. "It's real. The sanctuary is real. On your feet, wolves of Ashen Peak, walk toward the warmth." Driven by the miraculous, impossible scent of spring, the dying pack found a final, impossible reserve of strength. They hauled each other out of the snowdrifts, leaning on one another, their hollow eyes fixed on the impenetrable wall of white ahead of them. Cassian marched forward, the warm breeze growing stronger with every step, completely unaware that the paradise he was running toward was not unguarded. And the gatekeeper was the very woman he had thrown into the snow to die. The transition was not gradual. It was a violent, breathtaking fracture in the very fabric of the world. One moment, Alpha Cassian was dragging his frostbitten boots through knee-deep, blinding white snow, fighting a gale that threatened to rip the flesh from his bones. The next moment, he stepped through an invisible threshold, and the blizzard simply ceased to exist. The deafening, ear-splitting howl of the wind vanished, replaced by an impossible, profound stillness. The biting sleet stopped mid-air, falling away into nothingness. Cassian stood frozen in his tracks, his chest heaving, his breath no longer pluming into freezing white clouds. He blinked, the ice crusting his eyelashes, melting instantly in the sudden, radiant heat. Before him stood a miracle that defied all logic, nature, and reason. Rising from the frozen, cracked earth of the Deadlands was a colossal, towering wall of swirling, luminescent, golden magical energy. It stretched up into the sky, disappearing into the dark storm clouds, and curved outward, forming a massive, protective dome over a vast expanse of territory. The barrier was translucent, shimmering like the surface of a sunlit ocean, and through the glowing veil, the dying wolves of Ashen Peak could see the impossible. It was the sunlit cradle. Behind the golden barrier, there was no snow. There was no blight, no toxic dust, and no dead pines. Instead, a sprawling, breathtaking paradise of lush, vibrant green canopy stretched as far as the eye could see. Giant, ancient emerald oaks and flowering jasmine trees swayed in a gentle, warm breeze. Crystal-clear rivers cut through rich, dark earth, sparkling under a patch of sky that was perpetually blue and untouched by the winter storm raging just outside. Cassian's heightened alpha senses caught the unmistakable, rich scent of fat deer grazing on sweetgrass, the aroma of blooming wildflowers, and the intoxicating, pure essence of life itself. It was a feast for a starving kingdom. It was salvation perfectly preserved in a world of ash. A collective, ragged gasp ripped through the surviving members of the Ashen Peak Pack as they stumbled out of the blizzard and gathered behind their alpha. The elders fell to their knees in the snow, weeping openly, their tears cutting through the grime on their faces. Mothers held their dying pups up to the glowing light, pointing at the lush green paradise just steps away. The sheer, overwhelming relief of finding the myth, of knowing they were not going to die in the dark, swept through the pack like a tidal wave. Driven by the primal, desperate instinct to survive, a young, starving warrior let out a joyful cry. He dropped his heavy pack and sprinted toward the golden barrier, reaching his hands out to touch the warm, glowing surface, fully intending to run straight into the lush grass on the other side. He never made it through. The moment the young warrior's fingertips brushed the luminescent gold, the tranquil energy violently flared. A sharp, crackling sound, like a thunderclap striking an anvil, echoed across the tundra. The barrier flashed with blinding light, and the young warrior was violently hurled backward through the air. He hit the snow-covered ground 20 feet away, his clothes smoking, a groaning in agony as his skin blistered from the magical burn. The pack's joyful weeping instantly died, replaced by a horrified, suffocating silence. Cassian's heart plummeted into his stomach. He stepped forward slowly, his golden eyes wide with dawning dread. He approached the towering wall of light, feeling the immense ancient power radiating from it. It felt like standing before an open furnace. He reached out with his own massive, leather-clad hand, bracing his mind, and pressed his palm against the barrier. It was like touching a wall of solid, searing iron. The magic recognized his blood, evaluated his intent, and instantly rejected him. A searing, agonizing heat shot up Cassian's arm, forcing him to yank his hand back with a sharp hiss of pain. The leather of his glove was scorched black. They had found the gates to paradise, but they were locked out. "No," Selene whispered, stepping up beside Cassian. Her blue lips were trembling, her eyes wide with a manic, terrified refusal to accept defeat. "No, we didn't march through hell to be stopped by a glass wall. This is our land. The Ashen Peak takes what it needs to survive." Selene, fueled by the arrogant, brute force ideology that Cassian himself had instilled in the pack, refused to submit to the magic. She was a warrior. She had broken the bones of rival alphas and torn down fortress gates. She stepped back, her heavily muscled frame shuddering violently as she forced a rapid, agonizing shift. Bones cracked and reformed. Her pale skin sprouted thick, coarse gray fur. Within seconds, Selene stood not as a woman, but as a massive, monstrous, dire wolf, standing 7 feet at the shoulder. She snarled, burst her jaws dripping with feral saliva, her eyes burning with desperate fury. She dug her massive claws into the frozen earth, kicking up a spray of snow and dirt. "Selene, wait!" Cassian yelled, his instincts screaming that this was a fatal mistake. But the false Luna didn't listen. She let out a deafening, blood-curdling roar and launched herself directly at the golden barrier with every ounce of her colossal strength. She hit the magical shield with the momentum of a runaway freight train, fully intending to shatter the magic with pure physical dominance. The impact was catastrophic. The barrier didn't just repel her, it punished her. A massive shockwave of pure, divine kinetic energy rippled outward from the point of impact. The sound of Selene's bones cracking echoed like a volley of gunfire over the howling wind. The massive dire wolf was blasted backward with terrifying velocity, spinning wildly through the air before slamming brutally into the jagged trunk of a dead pine tree. Selene fell into the snow, a broken, whimpering heap. Her body immediately lost the strength to maintain the shift, forcefully reverting her back to her human form. She lay in the freezing slush, clutching her shattered collarbone, coughing up blood, completely paralyzed by the pain. Force could not open the gates of the gods. Brute strength, the very foundation of the Ashen Peak Pack, the sole metric by which Cassian had judged the worth of his people and his mate, was entirely, laughably impotent against the divine. The realization hit Cassian with the devastating force of an avalanche. His entire worldview, his brutal philosophy of survival of the fittest, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He looked at his broken Luna bleeding in the snow, and then he looked at his starving, freezing pack. The brief flash of hope had been extinguished, replaced by a despair so profound it threatened to stop Cassian's heart. The pack began to wail. It was the cruelest, most sadistic joke the universe could have played on them. They were going to starve to death, freezing in the snow, while staring at fat deer grazing in a sunlit meadow just inches from their faces. Cassian fell to his knees. The great Alpha, the warlord of the mountains, completely broke. He pressed his forehead against the searing, impenetrable golden barrier, the magic burning his skin, and he wept. He wept for the pups who wouldn't see the morning, and he wept for the catastrophic arrogance that had doomed them all. "We are finished," Cassian whispered to the glowing magic, his voice a cracked, hollow rasp. "The gods have locked the doors." But as Cassian's tears fell onto the scorched earth, the golden energy of the barrier suddenly shifted. The humming vibration of the magic changed pitch, deepening into a resonant, melodic chime that silenced the wailing of the pack. Cassian lifted his head, wiping the tears from his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. Deep within the lush, sunlit forest on the other side of the barrier, a shadow moved among the emerald oak trees. The pack froze, scrambling to the edge of the barrier, pressing their faces as close to the heat as they dared. Someone was in there. A figure was walking slowly through the tall, vibrant sweetgrass, moving with an eerie, perfect grace. As the silhouette stepped out from the shade of the great trees and into the bright golden sunlight of the cradle, the breath left Cassian's lungs entirely. It was a woman. She walked directly toward the edge of the barrier, the crystal-clear waters of a small brook parting gently around her bare feet. She did not look like a survivor of the Deadlands. She looked like a deity. The pack watched in absolute, paralyzed silence as the figure stopped just inches from the other side of the golden glass, standing face to face with the kneeling Alpha. Cassian's heart stopped. The universe had not locked the doors to paradise. It had simply given the keys to the one person he had thrown away. The woman standing on the other side of the golden barrier was a ghost resurrected into a goddess. Alpha Cassian remained on his knees in the freezing, bloody snow. His large hands pressed flat against the scorching magical shield. He could not blink. He could barely breathe. His mind, trained for war and logic, violently fractured as he stared into the face of the mate he had condemned to death 3 years ago. It was Aurelia. But the fragile, shivering girl in the threadbare linen dress was gone. The woman who stood inches away, separated only by a translucent veil of ancient magic, radiated an overwhelming, ethereal vitality. She was draped in layers of flowing, pearlescent silks that seemed to be woven from captured moonlight and morning mist. Her skin, once pale and sickly from the pack's neglect, was now flushed with vibrant, sun-kissed warmth. Her dark hair cascaded down her back in thick, glossy waves, adorned with woven bands of blooming jasmine and emerald ivy. But it was her eyes that completely shattered the breath in Cassian's lungs. They were no longer the milky, dead, sightless orbs that the Ashen Peak warriors had mocked. The physical blindness remained. She did not look at Cassian's face, but rather slightly past him. Yet her eyes were entirely transformed. They were glowing. A mesmerizing, swirling galaxy of celestial silver light and liquid gold pulsed within her irises, shifting and turning like a living map of the cosmos. "Aurelia!" Cassian choked out, his voice nothing more than a ragged, frostbitten whisper. He sounded like a dying man praying to a deity he had spent his life blaspheming. Aurelia stopped at the very edge of the barrier. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to the rhythm of his failing heartbeat. She did not sneer at him. She did not look upon the starving, pathetic remnants of the pack that had cheered for her exile with anger or vindictive triumph. Her expression was one of profound ancient serenity, possessing a calm so deep and untouchable that it made Cassian's chest physically ache with shame. "You smell of ash and despair, Alpha Cassian," Aurelia spoke. Her voice was a revelation. It no longer held the quiet, trembling uncertainty of a bullied outcast. It resonated with the terrifying, beautiful frequency of the earth itself, the sound of shifting tectonic plates, rushing rivers, and wind through ancient canyons. It vibrated right through the golden barrier, sinking deep into the marrow of every starving wolf outside. "How?" Cassian gasped, tears of pure shock and agonizing guilt cutting tracks through the grime on his face. He pressed his face closer to the searing magic. "How are you alive? I watched you walk into the white abyss. There was no shelter. There was no prey. The Deadlands consume everything." Aurelia reached out. Her delicate, glowing fingers lightly brushed the inside of the golden barrier, exactly where Cassian's heavy hands were pressed on the outside. "The Deadlands only consume those who rely on the flesh to survive," Aurelia answered softly, her celestial eyes glowing brighter in the shade of the ancient oak tree behind her. "You cast me out because I could not see the enemies at your gates. You called me defective because my eyes could not perceive the dirt, the blood, and the snow that your pack worshipped." Behind Cassian, the whimpering of the Ashen Peak pups ceased. The elders, leaning heavily on their wooden staffs, hobbled closer to the barrier, their hollow eyes wide with terrifying realization. They remembered the old texts. They remembered the ancient myths that the warlords of Ashen Peak had burned generations ago. "My blindness was never a curse, Cassian," Aurelia continued, her resonant voice echoing over the howling wind of the tundra. "It was the price of admission. The moon goddess took my mortal sight so that my mind would not be distracted by the illusions of the physical world. When you pushed me out into the frozen wastes, I did not see a blinding white blizzard." She gestured gracefully to the sprawling, vibrant paradise behind her. "I possess Truesight," Aurelia declared, the absolute truth of her words slamming into the pack like a physical blow. "I see the spiritual ley lines of the earth. I see the glowing breath of the gods, the golden threads of magic that weave the world together. While your warriors spilled their blood to conquer dry dirt and dead pine trees, I was simply tracing the secret, glowing geography of the heavens. I walked a path of light straight through the storm, and the earth opened its arms to receive me." The horror of their own catastrophic ignorance crashed over the Ashen Peak Pack. For 3 years, they had believed themselves to be the apex predators of the world. They had bragged about their sharp eyes, their heavy muscles, and their lethal fangs. They had looked at the blind Luna and seen only a useless burden, an evolutionary failure that needed to be pruned from their mighty bloodline. Instead, they had been the blind ones. They had been blind to the divine. They were crude, ignorant beasts fighting over rotting scraps in the dark, entirely oblivious to the fact that the fragile woman they threw away was the only creature among them capable of seeing the actual universe. She had walked safely through a frozen hell because she was reading a map painted by the gods, while they had starved to death, relying on their own pathetic mortal senses. An elder in the back of the crowd dropped his staff. It clattered against a frozen rock. The old man fell to his bony knees in the snow, pressing his frostbitten hands together. He bowed his head so low it touched the bloody slush. "The true Luna," the elder wept, his voice cracking with absolute reverent awe. "Forgive us, goddess of the map. Forgive our blind arrogance." It started as a ripple, and then it became a tidal wave. The proud, ruthless warriors of the Ashen Peak vanguard, the very men and women who had laughed and thrown stones at Aurelia as she was marched out of the keep, began to collapse into the snow. They dropped their heavy, useless weapons. Mothers fell to their knees, holding their starving pups out toward the glowing barrier in desperate supplication. Within moments, the entire surviving population of the pack was kneeling in the dirt, their faces pressed to the frozen earth, weeping and begging for mercy from the woman they had condemned to die. Alpha Cassian remained at the barrier, paralyzed. The shattering of a warlord's ego is not a quiet event. It is a violent, psychological demolition. Cassian felt every foundation of his identity turn to dust. His belief in absolute power, his worship of brute strength, and his pride in his own tactical genius, all of it was a grotesque, laughable joke. He slowly turned his head to look back at the snowdrift behind him. Celine, the strong Luna he had chosen to replace Aurelia, was still lying in a pathetic, whimpering heap, coughing up blood from her shattered collarbone. Her massive muscles and feral rage had amounted to absolutely nothing against the ancient magic of the cradle. Cassian had traded a divine seer for a blunt instrument, and it had cost his people their lives. He turned back to Aurelia. She was standing in eternal spring, surrounded by a warmth and abundance that defied comprehension. She had not needed him. She had never needed his protection, his pack, or his armies. He was the one who had needed her. The moon goddess had given him the ultimate key to survival, and he had thrown it in the trash because it hadn't looked like a sword. Cassian's massive chest heaved as a sob. A sound he hadn't made since he was a child tore its way up his throat. He did not stand up to address her. He surrendered the last pathetic shred of his alpha pride. Cassian sank down from his kneeling position, pressing his hands and his forehead flat against the freezing, bloody mud at the base of the golden barrier. The mighty king of Ashen Peak prostrated himself entirely, laying in the dirt like a broken, defeated animal. "I was the blind one," Cassian wept, the agonizing truth tearing his soul to ribbons. His tears soaked into the frozen earth. "I was a fool, an arrogant, stupid beast. I condemned my own mate, and I condemned my people to the ash." Aurelia looked down at the massive, a trembling warlord groveling at her feet. She felt the desperate, starving heartbeats of the pups in the snow. She held the absolute, undeniable power of life and death over the entire Ashen Peak Pack. The sanctuary responded to her will. With a single thought, she could turn her back, walk into the sunlit forest, and let the blizzard finish the execution that Cassian had started 3 years ago. The wind howled behind the pack, whipping the snow into a frenzy, violently reminding them that time was running out. The freezing death was closing in, and the fate of an entire kingdom rested entirely in the hands of the exile. The howling winds of the Deadlands seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the judgment of the blind Luna. The Ashen Peak Pack, a people who had built their entire identity on dominance and fear, they were now nothing more than a shivering, weeping mass of broken bodies pressed into the freezing mud. Alpha Cassian's massive shoulders shook as he lay prostrated at the base of the golden barrier, his tears melting the frost beneath his face. He offered no excuses. He made no demands. He simply waited for the executioner's axe to fall, knowing with absolute certainty that he deserved it. But the toxic, arrogant ideology of the Ashen Peak had one final pathetic gasp left to give. From the snowdrift behind the groveling king, a ragged, bloody cough shattered the reverent silence. Selene dragged herself forward. The false Luna's left arm hung entirely useless at her side, her collarbone shattered from her arrogant attempt to break the divine barrier. Her face was a mask of agonizing pain, bruised ego, and desperate, clinging delusion. She could not comprehend the paradigm shift. Her mind, forged only in violence, violently rejected the idea that she was inferior to the frail, blind woman she had mocked. "Get up, Cassian!" Selene shrieked, her voice a hysterical, grating rasp that ruined the tranquil hum of the cradle's magic. She kicked at the legs of a kneeling elder, trying to force her way to the front. "Do not bow to her. She is a reject, a crippled outcast. I am your Luna." Selene stumbled to the barrier, her breath fogging the translucent gold. She glared through the magic at Aurelia, her teeth bared like a cornered rabid animal. "Open this wall, you defective wretch!" Selene demanded, raising her one good hand and slamming it weakly against the scorching shield, screaming as the magic burned her palm. "We are the vanguard of Ashen Peak. You owe us your loyalty. Open the gates, or when the blizzard breaks, I will tear you apart myself." Cassian lifted his head from the mud, horror and fury warring in his chest. "Selene, shut your mouth!" he roared, trying to scramble to his feet to silence her before she doomed them all. But Aurelia did not need a warlock or an alpha to protect her. She did not flinch at Selene's screaming. She did not raise her voice. Aurelia simply turned her glowing, celestial eyes toward the feral warrior woman and raised a single, delicate hand. The golden barrier hummed, shifting from a warm, melodic vibration to a deep, terrifying, sub-bass rumble that shook the frozen earth. A concentrated wave of divine atmospheric pressure shot through the barrier, striking Selene directly in the chest. Selene was thrown backward, her feet leaving the ground entirely. She slammed into the snow, and before she could even draw breath to scream, the invisible pressure pinned her flat against the ice. It was a crushing, absolute weight, the gravitational force of a star pressing down on her limbs. She couldn't move a single muscle. She could barely inflate her lungs. Her eyes bulged in pure, unadulterated terror as she stared up at the blind Luna. "You are a warrior of ash, Selene," Aurelia spoke, her resonant voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority. "You worship the breaking of bone and the spilling of blood. But there is no war here for you to fight. Your strength is poison to this earth, and your commands hold no power in the realm of the gods. Be silent." Selene's jaw locked. The false Luna was utterly, humiliatingly silenced, pinned to the dirt like a helpless insect by a woman who hadn't even broken a sweat. Aurelia lowered her hand, and the terrifying pressure eased just enough to let Selene breathe, though she remained paralyzed in the snow. The celestial seer then turned her glowing gaze back down to Cassian. The Alpha was back on his knees, his hands clasped tightly before him. He looked at the effortless display of divine power, realizing just how microscopic he truly was in the grand design of the world. He had tried to play God in a dying forest, completely blind to the actual heavens. "Aurelia, please," Cassian's voice broke. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her bare feet, unworthy of meeting her celestial gaze. "I do not ask for my own life. I am a fool. I am a tyrant who led his people to the slaughter because of his own blind. Oh, stupid pride. Let the blizzard take me. Let the Deadlands have my bones as payment for what I did to you. But I beg of you, the pups, the elders, they only followed my commands. Do not let them freeze in the dark." He bowed his head again, his forehead touching the mud. "I surrender my alpha blood. I surrender my title, my life, and my soul. Just let the innocent cross the threshold." A heavy, profound silence fell over the tundra, broken only by the whistling wind of the encroaching storm. Aurelia looked at the dying wolves. She saw the shivering mothers, the fading pups, and the shattered king groveling in the dirt. She possessed the power to exact the ultimate revenge. She could let them watch paradise while they slowly turned to ice. It would be poetic justice. It would be exactly what they deserved. But Aurelia was not an alpha. She did not rule through cruelty or vengeance. "The sunlit cradle does not belong to a king," Aurelia declared, her voice a soothing balm that washed over the panicked heartbeats of the pack. "It belongs to the earth. And the earth does not turn away the starving." Aurelia stepped back, opening her arms wide. The colossal towering wall of golden magical energy did not shatter. It parted. Like massive, glowing curtains being drawn back, the barrier seamlessly split down the middle. A wide, clear path opened before the Ashen Peak Pack, releasing a rushing tide of warm, jasmine-scented spring air directly into the freezing blizzard. The transition was instantaneous. The snow beneath the pack's feet instantly melted into rich, warm soil. The biting cold vanished. "Enter," Aurelia commanded gently. The pack didn't hesitate. Weeping, praising the moon goddess and chanting Aurelia's name, the survivors scrambled forward. Elders dropped their staffs, finding new strength in the warm air. Mothers clutched their pups, running across the threshold and collapsing into the soft, vibrant sweetgrass on the other side. They drank frantically from the crystal-clear brook, the pure water instantly reviving their fading strength. Only 2 wolves remained on the outside of the barrier. Selene lay paralyzed in the melting slush, her eyes wide with panic, and Cassian remained on his knees at the threshold, keeping his promise. He watched his people find salvation, a bittersweet, agonizing relief washing over him. He prepared to stand up and walk backward into the white abyss of the blizzard to die alone. "Where are you going, Cassian?" Aurelia's voice stopped him dead in his tracks. Cassian looked back over his shoulder. The barrier was slowly beginning to close behind the pack. "I made a vow," he rasped. "My life for theirs. I am an exile now." "No," Aurelia said softly, stepping closer to the closing gap. "Death in the snow is an easy escape for a warlord. It is a coward's reprieve from the weight of his own guilt. You do not get to die an honorable martyr, Cassian." Cassian turned around, confused, the warm breeze ruffling his dark, snow-drenched hair. "You will enter the cradle," Aurelia commanded, her glowing eyes locking onto his broken golden ones. "But you will not enter as an alpha. The Ashen Peak Pack is dead. Your crown is ash. You and Celine will cross this threshold as mortals. You will be stripped of your titles, your authority, and your pride. You will haul the water. You will tend the earth. You will serve the very elders and pups you failed to protect." Cassian stared at her, the reality of her judgment sinking in. She was offering him life, but it was a life of absolute servitude. He would have to live every single day in the shadow of the breathtaking power he was once too arrogant to see. He would have to watch the woman he was meant to rule beside sit upon a throne he could never touch. It was the ultimate, inescapable penance, and it was far more merciful than he deserved. Cassian reached up and unclasped the heavy, dark wolf pelt mantle from his shoulders, the symbol of his alpha reign. He let the heavy fur drop into the freezing mud of the Deadlands. Stripped of his armor and his pride, he stood up. He walked over to the paralyzed Celine, grabbing the fallen warrior by the scruff of her tunic, hauling her to her feet. She leaned against him, broken and silent. Together, the disgraced king and his false Luna walked forward, crossing the threshold into the sunlit cradle, just as the golden barrier sealed shut behind them, locking the freezing death out forever. Cassian fell to his knees in the soft, warm grass. He looked up at Aurelia, the blind Luna, the savior of his people, and the eternal keeper of paradise. He bowed his head, no longer a ruler, but a humbled, eternally indebted servant to the light. But what do you think? Was Aurelia right to let the pack into paradise after they threw her out to die? Was Cassian's demotion to a servant a fitting punishment for his arrogance? Or did the ruthless alpha deserve to be left out in the freezing snow? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this epic tale of divine karma, a profound regret, and the ultimate power reversal, please smash that like button and share this video with your fellow werewolf romance fans. And if you want to find out how Cassian handles his new life as a servant to his goddess mate, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next epic tale.